guys, happy Monday. It is April 24th. 24th? 24th. No, it's not. It's the 27th. It's 26. I don't know. I'm losing my days, guys. I've been shut in so long, I can't remember. It's Monday. It's the last Monday in April. Anybody else feeling the strain of the quarantine? Haven't been out for a while. Sat on the porch, did some reading. I'm more busy now than I was when we were at school, and I had 2 shows going on and speech and debate. So that's kind of interesting. I spend a lot of time trying to get through grading and stuff. So this week we're going to finish up our novel. A lot of you are really now, once you saw that your grade was missing things, thank you very much. You're getting your stuff in, and I appreciate it. Thank you for being responsible, and thank you for being on top of things. Remember to check the remind and your email because I'm sending you all kinds of stuff. Today, I'm going to read chapters 26, 27, and 28. Our searching page has all 3 of those chapters. We're heading into the finish. Tom Robinson has been convicted, and now he has died. I kind of gave up all hope. And things are starting to wind down. Okay. So grab your books. We are starting chapter 26. And here we go. You with me? Hope so. There you go. All right. School started, and so did our daily trips past the Radley place. Jim was in the 7th grade and went to high school. Beyond the grammar school building, I was now in the 3rd grade, and our routines were so different. I only walked to school with Jim in the mornings, and I saw him at mealtimes. He went out for football, but was too slender and too young yet to do anything but carry the team water buckets. This he did with enthusiasm. Most afternoons, he was seldom home before dark. Now, the Radley place had ceased to terrify me, but it was no less gloomy, no less chilly under its great oaks, and no less uninviting. Mr. Nathan Radley could still be seen on a clear day walking to and from town. We knew Boo was there for the same old reason. Nobody'd seen him carried out yet. And I sometimes felt a twinge of remorse when passing by the old place at ever having been taken part in what must have been seen as sheer torment to Arthur Radley. What reasonable recluse wants children peeping through his shutters, delivering greetings on the end of a fishing pole and wandering off in his collards at night? Isn't that interesting? 2 years later, and now he's, in her mind, he's just a recluse. He likes to be inside. He doesn't want to deal with the people outside. And yeah, there's a different connotation. There's a different respect level. Not that they ever disrespected Arthur, but there's just a difference in how they look at him and how he lives. And that's a good thing. Okay. And yet I remembered 2 Indian head pennies, chewing gum, soap dolls, a rusty medal, a broken watch and chain, and Jim must have put them away somewhere. I stopped and I looked at the tree one afternoon. The trunk was swelling around the cement patch. The patch itself was turning yellow. We'd almost seen him a couple times, a good enough score for anybody. But I still looked for him each time I went by. Maybe someday we could see him. I imagined how it would be when it happened. He'd just be sitting in the swing when I came along. Well, howdy do, Mr. Arthur, I would say, as if I'd said it every afternoon of my life. Evening, Jean Louise, he would say, as if he'd said it every afternoon of my life. Pretty right spell we're having, isn't it? Yes, sir, right pretty, I would say, and so on. It was only a fantasy. We would never see him. He probably did go out when the moon was down and gaze upon Miss Stephanie Crawford. I'd have picked somebody else to look at, but that was his business. He'd never gaze at us. You aren't starting that again, are you? Said Atticus one night when I expressed a stray desire just to have one good look at Boo Radley before I died. If you are, I'll tell you right now, stop it. I'm too old to go chasing you off the Radley property. Besides, it's dangerous. I might get shot. You know, Mr. Nathan shoots at every shadow he sees, even shadows that leave size 4 bare footprints. You were lucky not to be killed. I hushed then and there, and at the same time, I marveled at Atticus. This is the first he'd let us know he knew a lot more about something than we thought he knew. And it happened years ago. No, only last summer. No, summer before last. When? Tom was playing tricks on me. I must remember to ask Jim. So many things had happened to us. Bill Radley was the least of our fears. Atticus said he didn't see how anything else could happen, that things have a way of settling down. And after enough time passed, people would forget that Tom Robinson's existence was ever brought to their attention. Perhaps Atticus was right, but the events of the summer hung over us like smoke in a closed room. The adults in Macomb never discussed the case with Jim and me. It seemed that they discussed it with their children, and their attitude must have been that neither of us could help having Atticus for a parent. So their children must be nice to us in spite of him. The children would never have thought that up for themselves. Had our classmates been left to their own devices, Jim and I would have had several swift, satisfying fistfights apiece and ended the matter for good. As it was, we were compelled to hold our heads high and be, respectively, a gentleman and a lady. In a way, it was like the era of Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose, without all her yelling. Now, there was an odd thing, though, that I never understood. In spite of Atticus's shortcomings as a parent, people were content to reelect him to the state legislature that year, as usual, without opposition. I came to the conclusion that people were just peculiar. I withdrew from them, and I never thought about them until I was forced to. I was forced to one day, once a week in school. Once a week, we had a current events period. Each child was supposed to clip an item from a newspaper, absorb its contents, and reveal them to the class. Well, this practice allegedly overcame a variety of evils. Standing in front of his fellows encouraged good posture and gave a child poise. Delivering a short talk made him word conscious. Learning his current events strengthened his memory, and being singled out made him even more anxious to return to the group. Now, the idea was profound, but as usual in Macomb, it didn't work very well. In the first place, few rural children had access to newspapers, so the burden of current events was borne by the town children, convincing the bus children more deeply that the town children got all the attention anyway. The rural children who could usually brought clippings from what they called the grit paper. It's a publication spurious in the eyes of Miss Gates, our teacher. And why she frowned on when a child recited from the grit paper, I never knew. But in some way, it was associated with like fiddling and eating syrupy biscuits for lunch and being a holy roller and singing Sweetly Sings the Donkey and pronouncing it donkey, all of which the state paid teachers to discourage. Even so, not many of the children knew what a current event was. So little Chuck Little, 100 years old in his knowledge of cows and their habits, was halfway through a Uncle Natural story when Miss Gates stopped him. Charles, that is not a current event. That is an advertisement. Cecil Jacobs knew what one was, though, and when his turn came, he went to the front of the room and he began, Old Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Cecil, said Miss Gates. One never begins with old anybody. Yes, ma'am, he said. Old Adolf Hitler has been persecuting Cecil. No, Miss Gates, it says here, well, anyway, old Adolf Hitler has been after the Jews, and he's putting them in prisons, and he's taken away all their property, and he won't let any of them out of the country, and he's washing all the feeble-minded. Washing the feeble-minded? Yes, ma'am. Miss Gates, I reckon they don't have sense enough to wash themselves. I mean, I don't reckon an idiot could keep himself clean. Well, anyway, Hitler started a program to round up all the half Jews too, and he wants to register them in case they might want to cause him any trouble. And I think this is a very bad thing, and that's my current event. So, if you were unaware during the Holocaust, yes, the Nazis, if you were of Jewish religion or even half Jewish, if say one parent was Catholic and the other half was Jewish, doesn't matter, or you had a cognitive disability. So any individual with an intellectual disability, he would get rid of them. Some went to the labor camps and some went right to the crematory ovens in the labor. So that was his job, was to eradicate, create genocide. That's something to be proud of. Sarcasm. Okay. Very good, Cecil, said Miss Gates. Puffin, Cecil returned to his seat, and a hand went up to the back of the room. How can he do that? Who do what? Asked Miss Gates patiently. Well, I mean, how can Hitler just put a lot of folks in a pen like that? Looks like the government stop him, said the owner of the hand. Hitler is the government, said Miss Gates, and seizing an opportunity to make education dynamic, she went to the blackboard. She printed democracy in large letters. Democracy, she said. Does anybody have a definition? Us, somebody said. I raised my hand, remembering an old campaign slogan that Atticus had once told me about. What do you think it means, Jean Louise? Equal rights for all, special privileges for none, I quoted. Very good, Jean Louise. Very good. Miss Gates smiled, and in front of democracy, she printed, We are a. Now, class, say it together. We are a democracy. Go ahead, say it. We're a democracy. We said it. And then Miss Gates said, That's the difference between America and Germany. We're a democracy and Germany is a dictatorship. Dictatorship, she said. And over here, we don't believe in persecuting anybody. Persecution comes from people who are prejudiced. Prejudice, she enunciated carefully. There are no better people in the world than the Jews, and why Hitler doesn't think so is a mystery to me. An inquiring soul in the middle of the room said, Why don't they like the Jews, you reckon, Miss Gates? I don't know, Henry. They contribute to every society they live in, and most of all, they are a deeply religious people. Hitler's trying to do away with a religion, so maybe he doesn't like them for that reason. Cecil spoke up. Well, I don't know for certain, he said, but they're supposed to change money or something, but that ain't any cause to persecute them. They're white, ain't they? Miss Gates said, When you get to high school, Cecil, you'll learn that the Jews have been persecuted since the beginning of history, even driven out of their own country. It's one of the most terrible stories in history. Time for arithmetic, children. Yep, there's the irony. So let's go back and look at that. She's talking about the Jews and the Nazis creating genocide to get rid of them, persecuting them, and I don't understand. They are an active product of our society. How hypocritical is it of her to say that with the way the African Americans are treated, the blacks are treated? So let's go back and look at that, guys. Miss Gates says they contribute to every society that they live in, and most of all, they're deeply religious people. Well, couldn't we say that? Let's just take our African Americans, our blacks in this story. Let's take Calpurnia and her children, and Tom Robinson and his wife and their children. We know that they go to church. We know they're an active part. They work, they live out in their own community, but they're working for other people. They are providing a living for their children. They are an active part of the economy, give and take, earning a living, giving back to the economy. But aren't we persecuting them? Are we not doing the same things? They were driven out of their own country by blacks and by whites at the time and forced onto slave ships and deposited. Wow. So Miss Gates is creating a hypocritical moment, thinking she's being very, very smart about it. But what she's showing is that we treat people of culture, ethnicity, the same way. The same way. When during the Civil War, they were beaten. I mean, from the Revolutionary War, from the time they were driven out of their country, they were mistreated, they were beaten, they were killed, they were raped, they were assaulted. What's the difference? They're just people, right? They're just folks. Folks is folks, right? Let that sink in. Good and hard. As I had never liked arithmetic, I spent the period looking out the window. And the only time I ever saw Atticus scowl was when Elmer Davis would give us the latest on Hitler. Atticus would snap off the radio and say, hmm. And I asked him once why he was impatient with Hitler. And Atticus said, because he's a maniac. Well, this would not do, I mused. And as the class proceeded with its sums, one maniac and millions of German folks. Looks to me like they'd shut Hitler up in a pen instead of letting him shut them out. There's something else that was wrong. I would have to ask my father about it. I did, but he said he could not possibly answer my question because he didn't know the answer. But it's okay to hate Hitler. It is not. He said it's not okay to hate anybody. Atticus, I said, there's something I don't understand. Miss Gates said it was awful, Hitler doing like he does. She got real red in the face about it. Well, I think she would. But, yes, nothing, sir. I went away, not sure that I could explain to Atticus what was on my mind, not sure that I could clarify what was only a feeling. Perhaps Jim could provide the answer. Jim understood school things better than Atticus. Jim was worn out from a day's water carrying, and there were at least 12 banana peels on the floor by his bed, surrounding an empty milk bottle. What you stuffing for? I asked. Well, the coach says if I can gain 25 pounds by year after next, I can play, he said. This is the quickest way. If you don't throw it all up, Jim, I said, I want to ask you something. Shoot. He put down his book and he stretched his legs. Miss Gates is a nice lady, isn't she? Why, sure, said Jim. I liked her when I was in her room. Yeah, she hates Hitler a lot. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, she went on today about how bad it was for him treating the Jews like that. Jim, it's not right to persecute anybody, is it? I mean, have mean thoughts about anybody, even, is it? Gracious, no, Scout. Well, what's eating you? Well, coming out of the courthouse that night, Miss Gates was. She was going down the stairs in front of us. You must not have seen her. She was talking to Miss Stephanie Crawford. And I heard her say, it's time somebody taught them a lesson. They were getting way above themselves, and the next thing you know, they think they can do is marry us. Jim, how can you hate Hitler so bad and then turn around and be ugly about folks right at home? Jim was suddenly furious. He leaped off the bed, he grabbed me by the collar, and he shook me. I never want to hear about that courthouse again, ever. Ever. Do you hear me? You hear me? Don't you ever say one word about it to me again. You hear? Now go on. Uh, I was too surprised to cry. I crept from Jim's room and I shut the door softly lest undue noise set him off again. Suddenly tired, I wanted Atticus. He was in the living room and I went to him and I tried to get in his lap. Atticus smiled. You're getting so big now, I'll just have to hold part of you. And he held me close. Scout, he said softly, don't let Jim get you down. He's having a rough time these days. I heard you back there. Atticus said Jim was trying to forget something, but what he was really doing was storing it away for a while until enough time had passed. And then he'd be able to think about it and sort things out. When he was able to think about it, Jim would be himself again. Chapter 27. Things did settle down after a fashion, as Atticus said they would, and by the middle of October, only two things out of the ordinary happened to make him citizens. No, no, there were three things, and they didn't directly concern us, the Finches, but in a way they did. So the first thing was that Mr. Bob Ewell acquired and lost a job in a matter of days, and probably made himself unique in the annuals of the 1930s. He was the only man I ever heard of who was fired from the WPA for laziness. Remember, the WPA was the program that the president had put in place to give jobs during the Depression so that we could stimulate the economy and get things going again. It's pretty hard to get fired from the WPA. He was fired because he was lazy. Interesting. File that away. I suppose his brief burst of fame brought on a briefer burst of industry, but his job lasted only as long as his notoriety. Mr. Ewell found himself as forgotten as Tom Robinson. He thought this whole thing with the rape would make him popular in town, that would change him and people would put him on a pedestal. It didn't work that way. Nope, because they know what he's like. Okay. Thereafter, he resumed his regular weekly appearances at the welfare office for his check, and he received it with no grace amid obscure mutterings that the bastards who thought they ran this town wouldn't permit an honest man to make a living. Now, Ruth Jones, the welfare lady, said Mr. Ewell openly accused Atticus of getting his job. So Bob Ewell is telling tales around town as he's meandering that Atticus took his job. Atticus, the attorney, who went to school and educated himself with a collegiate degree, post-secondary degree, Bob is saying that's his job. Make no sense? You got it. Okay. Ruth Jones, the welfare lady, said Mr. Ewell had openly accused Atticus of getting his job. She was upset enough to walk down to Atticus's office and tell him about it. Atticus told Miss Ruth not to fret, but that if Bob Ewell wanted to discuss Atticus's getting his job, he knew the way to the office. Now, the second thing happened to Judge Taylor. Judge Taylor was not a Sunday night churchgoer. Mrs. Taylor was. Now, Judge Taylor savored his Sunday night hour alone in his big house, and church time found him holed up in his study reading the writings of Bob Taylor. No kin. But the judge would have been proud to claim it. Now, one Sunday night, lost in fruity metaphors and florid diction, Judge Taylor's attention was wrenched from the page by an irritating scratching noise. Hush, he said to Ann Taylor, his fat, nondescript dog. Then he realized he was talking to an empty room. The scratching noise was coming from the rear of the house. Judge Taylor clumped to the back porch to let Ann out, and he found the screen door swinging open. Shadow on the corner of the house caught his eye, and that was all he saw of his visitor. Mrs. Taylor came home from church to find her husband in his chair, lost in the writings of Bob Taylor, with a shotgun across his lap. The third thing happened to Helen Robinson, Tom's widow. Now, if Mr. Ewell is forgotten as Tom Robinson was as forgotten as Boo Radley. But Tom was not forgotten by his employer, Mr. Link Dees. Now, Mr. Link Dees made a job for Helen. He didn't really need her, but he said he felt right bad about the way things turned out. And I never knew who took care of his children while Helen was away. Calpurnia said it was hard on Helen because she had to walk nearly a mile out of her way to avoid the Ewells, who, according to Helen, chunked at her the first time she tried to use the public road. Remember that road that the community of the African Americans goes right by the Ewells, the dump, and then the Ewells. Chunking means throwing stones, rocks, big stones. Okay. So she's walking out to the highway, going a mile out of her way and dangerous to get into town. All right. Mr. Langdese eventually received the impression that Helen was coming to work each morning from the wrong direction and dragged the reason out of her. Just let it be, Mr. Link. Please, sir, Helen begged. The hell I will, said Mr. Link. He told her to come by his store that afternoon before she left. She did. And Mr. Link closed his store, put his hat firmly on his head, and he walked Helen home. Now, he walked her the short way by the Ewells. And on his way back, Mr. Link stopped at the crazy gate. Ewell, he called. I say, Ewell. The windows, normally packed with children, were empty. I know. Every last one of you is in there laying on the floor. Now, you hear me, Bobby Well. If I hear one more peep out of my girl Helen about not being able to walk this road, I'll have you in jail before sundown. Mr. Link spat in the dust. There's Stella. And walked home. Helen went to work next morning and used the public road. Nobody chunked at her. But when she was a few yards beyond the Ewell house, she looked around and she saw Mr. Ewell walking behind her. He was stalking her, guys. He's stalking her. That's not frightening at all. She turned and walked on, and Mr. Ewell kept the same distance behind her until she reached Mr. Langde's house. Okay? All the way to the house, Helen said she heard a soft voice behind her crooning foul words. So, guys, he is just far enough behind her, and he is talking nasty, nasty talk. Okay? He's stalking her, which wasn't a law crime yet. Okay? Thoroughly frightened, she telephoned Mr. Link at his store, which was not far from his house. As Mr. Link came out of his store, he saw Mr. Ewell leaning on the fence. Mr. Ewell said, "Don't you look at me, Langdese, like I was dirt. I ain't jumped you. First thing you can do, Ewell, is to get your stinking carcass off my property. You're leaning on it, and I can't afford fresh paint for it. Second thing you can do is stay away from my cook, or I'll have you up for assault." I ain't touched her, Langdese, and ain't about to go with no nigger. You don't have to touch her. All you have to do is to make her afraid. And if assault ain't enough to keep you locked up for a while, I'll get you in on the ladies' law. So get out of my sight. If you don't think I mean it, you just bother that girl again. Well, Mr. Ewell evidently thought he meant it, for Helen reported no further trouble. I don't like it, Atticus. I don't like it at all, was Aunt Alexandra's assessment of the events. That man seems to have a permanent running grudge against everybody connected with that case. I know how that kind are about paying off grudges, but I don't understand why he should harbor one. He had his way in court, didn't he? Stella, come here. Get up here. Show your face. Yeah, this is what's making all the noise at our house right now. No, you're naughty. You're being naughty. No, you're being naughty. I love you too, but you're being naughty. You done? I love you. All right. Now get. All right. There we go. So Aunt Alexandra has this. She's just thinking Bob is on a trail of havoc here. He's bugging. He's bugging Judge Taylor by scratching. It had to have been him. He's following Helen and being icky with that. Icky, that's the best word, icky. All right. Well, I think I understand, said Atticus. It might be because he knows in his heart that very few people in Bickham really believed his and Mayella's yarns. He thought he'd be a hero, but all he got for his pain was, okay, we'll convict this Negro, but get back to your dump. He's had his fling with about everybody now, so he ought to be satisfied. He'll settle down when the weather changes. But why should he try to burgle John Taylor's house? He obviously didn't know John was home, or he wouldn't have tried. Only lights John shows on Sunday nights are on the front porch and back in his den. You don't know if Bobby Well cut that screen. You don't know who did it, said Atticus, but I can guess. I proved him a liar. But John made him look like a fool. All the time Ewell was on the stand, I couldn't dare look at John and keep a straight face. John looked at him as if he were a three-legged chicken or a square egg. Don't tell me judges don't try prejudiced juries, Atticus chuckled, saying that John, part of the reason he wanted to ask Atticus this, he knew what Bob Ewell was. He knew who he was at the core of his being. By the end of October, our lives had become the familiar routine of school, play, study. Jim seemed to have put out of his mind whatever it was he wanted to forget. And our classmates mercifully let us forget our father's eccentricities. Now, Cecil Jacobs asked me one time if Atticus was a radical. And when I asked Atticus, Atticus was so amused, I was rather annoyed. But he said he wasn't laughing at me. He said, you tell Cecil I'm about as radical as Cotton Tom Heflin. Aunt Alexandra was thriving. Miss Maudie must have silenced the whole missionary society at one blow, for Auntie again ruled that roost. Her refreshments grew even more delicious. I learned more about the poor Morena's social life from listening to Mrs. Merriweather. They had so little sense of family that the whole tribe was one big family. A child had as many fathers as there were men in the community, and as many mothers as there were women. J. Grimes Everett was doing his utmost to change the state of affairs and desperately needed our prayers. So, trying to change the culture of the people. Okay. Macomb was itself again. Now, precisely the same as last year and the year before that, with only two minor changes. Firstly, people had removed from their store windows and automobiles the stickers that said, NRA, we do our part. Okay. That's the National Recovery Act from the Depression, not the National Rifle Association. I asked Atticus why, and he said it was because the National Recovery Act was dead. And I asked who killed it, and he said 9 old men, Supreme Court. The second change in Macomb since last year was not one of, well, national significance. Excuse me. Until then, Halloween in Macomb was a completely unorganized affair. Each child did what he wanted to do with the assistance from other children if there was anything to be moved, such as placing a light buggy on top of the livery stable. So for Halloween, that's when people were being pranked, okay, being punked. Not a big deal, right? Okay. But parents thought things went too far last year when the peace of Miss Tootie and Miss Fruity were shattered. All right. Miss Tootie and Fruity Barber were maiden ladies, sisters, who lived together in the only Macomb residence boasting a cellar. Remember, they are in deep Alabama, not a lot of cellars because of the water tables, but the Barber sisters have a root cellar. Just so happens you got Tootie and you got Fruity. Whoop-a-doo! And I say that because they're elderly, and you'll see here. Okay. So the Barber ladies were rumored to be Republicans, having migrated from Clanton, Alabama, in 1911. Now, their ways were strange to us, and why they wanted a cellar, nobody knew. But they wanted one, and they dug one, and they spent the rest of their lives chasing generations of children out of it. Now, Mrs. Tootie and Fruity, their names were Sarah and Frances, aside from their Yankee ways, were both deaf. Miss Tootie denied it and lived in a world of silence, but Miss Fruity, not about to miss anything, employed an ear trumpet so enormous that Jim declared it was a loudspeaker for one of those dog Victrolas. So before we had the hearing aids, it was like a little horn, and the bell of it, depending, it could be big, could be small. Okay, so that's what she's using to try and hear. So we have two elderly sisters that live together, elderly, and one is completely deaf but denies it. The other one is deaf and denies it but has an ear trumpet. Okay. Now, with these facts in mind and Halloween at hand, some wicked children had waited until the Mrs. Barber were thoroughly asleep, slipped into their living room, nobody but the Radleys locked up, stealthily made away with every stick of furniture therein, and hid it in the cellar. I deny having taken part in the thing. So the kids came in at night, took on the bottom level. So you're looking at a dining room, a parlor, the kitchen, took every stick of furniture, sofa, coffee table, end tables, lamps, whatever, put it all down in the root cellar. So when they get up in the morning, they come down, they think that either A, they've been robbed, or they're like, what happened to our stuff? Okay. I heard him, was the cry that awoke the Mrs. Barber's neighbors at dawn the next day. I heard him drive up in a truck up to the door. They stomped around like horses. They're in New Orleans by now. Get here. So they're making tales. Miss Tootie was sure those traveling fur sellers who came through town 2 days ago had purloined their furniture. Dark they were, she said. Syrians. It's not a new thing to be prejudiced against people from the Middle East. It's not. It's been an ongoing pile of junk for ages. Just prejudice, prejudice, prejudice. Okay? Mr. Hectate was summoned. He surveyed the area and said he thought it was a local job. Miss Fruity said she'd know a making voice anywhere, and there were no making voices in that parlor last night. They were rolling their R's all over her premises. They were saying that they were immigrants, rolling their R's. Nothing less than the bloodhounds must be used to locate the furniture, Miss Tootie insisted. So Mr. Tate was obliged to go 10 miles out the road, round up the county hounds, put them on the trail. Just wait. Mr. Tate started him off at Mrs. Barber's front steps, but all they did was run around to the back of the house and howl at the cellar door. When Mr. Tate set him in motion 3 times, he finally guessed the truth. By noon time that day, there was not a barefooted child to be seen in Macomb, and nobody took off his shoes until the hounds were returned. So the Macomb ladies said things would be different this year. The high school auditorium would be open, and there'd be a pageant for the grown-ups, apple bobbing, taffy pulling, pinning the tail on the donkey for the children. There would also be a prize of 25 cents for the best Halloween costume created by the wearer. Jim and I both groaned. Not that we'd ever done anything was the principle of the thing. Jim considered himself too old for Halloween anyway. He said he wouldn't be caught anywhere near the high school and it's something like that. Oh, well, I thought Atticus would take me. I soon learned, however, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Oh, Mrs. Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant entitled Macomb County Ad Astra per Aspera. And I was to be a ham. Yep, you got it, a ham. Pork, a ham. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the county's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed up to look like a cow, and Agnes Boone would make a lovely butter bean, and another child would be a peanut, and on down the line until Mrs. Merriweather's imagination and the supply of children were exhausted. Our only duties, as far as I could gather from our 2 rehearsals, were to enter from stage left as Mrs. Merriweather, not only the author, but the narrator, identified us. And when she called out, "Pork," that was my cue. So then the assembled company would sing, Macomb County, we will I be true to thee," as the grand finale. And Mrs. Merriweather would mount the stage with the state flag. Well, my costume was not much of a problem. Mrs. Crenshaw, the local seamstress, had as much imagination as Mrs. Merriweather. Mrs. Crenshaw took some chicken wire and bent it into the shape of a cured ham. Then she covered with brown cloth, and she painted it to resemble the original. And I could duck under, and someone could pull the traption down over my head, and it came almost to my knees. Mrs. Crenshaw thoughtfully left 2 peepholes for me. Well, she did a fine job. Jim said I looked exactly like a ham with legs. Now, there were several discomforts, though. It was hot. It was a close fit, and if my nose itched, I couldn't scratch. And once inside, I could not get out of it alone. So it came on top, and her hands were basically pinned to her sides. In the movie version, there are it's been like surmised that there was armholes as well. But basically, once she's in that, she's trapped. She's got to have help to get out of the dang ham. All right. When Halloween came, I assumed the whole family would be present to watch me perform. But I was disappointed. Atticus said as tactfully as he could, he just didn't think he could stand a pageant tonight. He was all in. He'd been in Montgomery for a week, and he'd come home late that afternoon. He thought Jim might escort me if I asked him. Aunt Alexandra said she just had to get to bed early. She'd been decorating the stage all afternoon and was worn out. She stopped short in the middle of her sentence. She closed her mouth and then opened it to say something, but no words. "What's the matter, Auntie?" I asked. "Yeah, nothing, she said. "Somebody just walked over my grave." So if you've never heard that, it's somebody walked over your grave. It's similar to you having your spidey senses. Something is just telling you something is not right. You got that bad feeling something's going on, and you just can't put your finger on it. Okay? She put it away from her for whatever it was that gave her a pinprick of apprehension and suggested that I give the family a preview in the living room. So Jim squeezed me into my costume and stood at the living room door and called out, "Pork," exactly as Mrs. Merriweather would have done, and I marched in. And Atticus and Aunt Alexandra, they were delighted. I repeated my part for Calpurnia in the kitchen, and she said I was wonderful. I wanted to go across the street to show Miss Monty, but Jim said she'd probably be at the pageant anyway. After that, it didn't matter whether we went or not. Jim said he would take me. Thus began our longest journey together. Chapter 28. The weather was unusually warm for the last day of October, and we didn't need jackets. The wind was growing stronger, and Jim said it might be raining before we got home. There was no moon. Now, the street light on the corner cast sharp shadows on the Radley house, and I heard Jim laugh softly. "I bet nobody bothers them tonight," he said. Jim was carrying my ham costume, and rather awkwardly as it's hard to hold, and I thought it was gallant of him to do so. It's a scary place, though, ain't it? I said. I mean, Boo doesn't mean anybody any harm, but I'm right glad you're along. You know, Atticus wouldn't let you go to the schoolhouse by yourself, Jim said. Well, I don't see why it's just around the corner and across the yard. That yard's a mighty long place for little girls to cross at night, Jim teased. Ain't you afraid of haints? We laughed. Haints, hot steams, incantations, secret signs had vanished with our years as mist with sunrise. What was that old thing Jim said? Angel, bright, life and death. Get off the road, don't suck my breath. Cut it out now, I said. We were in front of the Radley place. Jim said, Boo must not be at home. Listen. High above us in the darkness, a solitary mocker poured out his repertoire in blissful awareness of whose tree he sat in, plunging from a shrill kee of the sunflower bird to an irascible of a blue jay to the sad lament of for Will, for Will, for Will. We turned the corner and I tripped on a root growing in the road. Jim tried to help me, but all he did was drop my costume in the dust. I didn't fall, though, and soon we were on our way again. We turned off the road and we entered the schoolyard, and it was pitch black. How do you know where we're at, Jim? I asked when we'd gone a few steps. Well, I can tell under the big oak because we're passing through a cool spot. Careful now and don't fall again. We'd slowed to a cautious gait and we were feeling our way forward so as not to bump into the tree. The tree was a single and ancient oak. Two children could not reach around its trunk and touch hands. It was far away from teachers, their spies, and curious neighbors. It was near the Radley lot, but the Radleys were not curious. A small patch of earth beneath its branches was packed hard from many fights and furtive crap games. So when you look on the map that I gave you, you'll see off to the side of the Radley place, there's a picture of the old oak. Okay. The lights in the high school auditorium were blazing in the distance, but they blinded us, if anything. Don't look ahead, Scout, Jim said. Look at the ground and you won't fall. You should have brought the flashlight, Jim. Well, I didn't know it was this dark. Didn't look like it'd be this dark early in the evening. It's cloudy, that's why. It'll hold off a while, though. Somebody leaped at us. Good almighty, Jim yelled. A circle of light burst in our faces, and Sequel Jacobs jumped in glee behind it. Ha ha! I gotcha! He shrieked. I thought you'd be coming along this way. What are you doing out here by yourself, boy? Ain't you scared of Boo Radley? Cecil had ridden safely to the auditorium with his parents, hadn't seen us, and then had ventured down this far because he knew good and well we'd be coming along. And he thought Mr. Finch would be with us, though. Shucks. Ain't much but around the corner, said Jim. Who's scared to go around the corner? We had to admit that Cecil was pretty good, though. He had given us a fright, and he could tell it to all over the schoolhouse. That was his privilege. Say, I said, aren't you a cow tonight? Where's your costume? It's up behind the stage, he said. Mrs. Merriweather says the pageant ain't coming on for a while. You could put yours backstage by mine, Scout, and we can go with the rest of them. Well, that was an excellent idea, Jim thought. He also thought a good thing that Cecil and I would be together. This way, Jim would be left to go with people of his own age. Now, when we reached the auditorium, the whole town was there, except Atticus and the ladies worn out from decorating, and the usual outcasts and shut-ins. Most of the country, it seemed, was there. The hall was teeming with slicked-up country people. The high school building had a wide downstairs hallway, and people milled around booths that had been installed along each side. Oh, Jim, I forgot my money, I said when I saw him. So imagine in our pack or in our ghettotorium, there were little booths on the sides. So kind of like all-inclusive carnival, little carnival. Okay. Oh, Jim, I forgot my money, I sighed when I saw them. Atticus didn't, Jim said. Here's 30 cents. You can do 6 things. I'll see you later on. It's a pretty big deal. Okay, I said, quite content with 30 cents, and Cecil. I went with Cecil down to the front of the auditorium through a door on one side and the backstage. I got rid of my ham costume and departed in a hurry, for Mrs. Merriweather was standing at a lectern in front of the first row of seats making last minute frenzied changes in the script. How much money you got? I asked Cecil. Cecil had 30 cents too, which made us even. We squandered our first nickels on the House of Horrors, which scared us not at all. We entered the black seventh grade room and we were led around the temporary Gulen residence, and we were made to touch several objects alleged to be the component parts of a human being. Here's his eyes, we were told when we touched two peeled grapes in a saucer. Here's his heart, which felt like raw liver. And these are his innards, and our hands thrust into a plate of cold spaghetti. Now, Cecil and I visited several booths. We each bought a sack of Mrs. Judge Taylor's homemade divinity. I wanted to bob for apples, but Cecil said it wasn't sanitary. His mother said he might catch something from everybody's heads having been in the same tub. Well, there ain't anything around town now to catch, I protested. See, we couldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be doing that. That is not responsible social distancing. I later asked Auntie about this, and she said people who held such views were usually climbers. What is she talking about? Aunt Alexandra is saying that Cecil's mother is being a social climber, being snotty. We don't dip with those people. We don't share apples. It's unsanitary. You don't know what those people are bringing. This has nothing to do with a virus, a cold, a flu. This was those people. But here's the funny. Aunt Alexandria is totally opposite and snubbing Cecil's mom. She's being a social climber. We welcome all people. There's nothing wrong with it. Who knew? See, Aunt Alexandria, people can change if they decide to. Okay. We were about to purchase a blob of taffy when Mrs. Merriweather's runners appeared and told us to go backstage. It was time to get ready. Now, the auditorium was filling with people, and Macomb County High School band was assembled in front below the stage, and the stage footlights were on, and the red velvet curtain rippled and billowed from the scurrying going on behind it. So everybody's trying to get ready. So imagine in our Performing Arts Center, everybody's out in the alleyway behind trying to get things ready, or behind the back curtain. You got the band out in front. Okay. Backstage, Cecil and I found the narrow hallway teeming with people. Adults in homemade three-corner hats, Confederate caps, Spanish-American war hats, and World War helmets. Children dressed as various agricultural enterprises crowded around the one small window. Somebody smashed my costume, I wailed in dismay. Mrs. Merriweather galloped to me, reshaped the chicken wire, and thrust me inside. You all right in there, Scout? Asked Cecil. You sound so far off like you was on the other side of a hill. You don't sound any nearer, I said. Well, the band played the national anthem, and we heard the audience rise, and then the bass drum sounded, and Mrs. Merriweather, stationed behind her lectern, beside the band, said, Macomb County ad astra per aspera. And the bass drum boomed again. That means, said Mrs. Merriweather, translating for the rustic elements, from the mud to the stars. She added, unnecessarily, it seemed to me, a pageant. Well, reckon they wouldn't know that if she didn't tell them, whispered Cecil, who was immediately shushed. The whole town knows it, I breathed. But the country folks have come in, Cecil said. Be quiet back there, a man's voice ordered. We were silent. The bass drum went boom with every sentence Mrs. Merriweather uttered. She chanted mournfully about the Macomb County being older than the state, that it was part of Mississippi and Alabama territories, that the first white man to set foot in the virgin forest was the probate judge's great grandfather 5 times removed, who was never heard of again. Then came the fearless Colonel Macomb, for whom the county was named. All right, so Andrew Jackson appointed him to a position of authority, and Colonel Macomb's misplaced self guidance and slender, slender sense of direction brought disaster to all who rode with him in the Creek Indian Wars. Colonel Macomb persevered in his efforts to make the region safe for democracy, but his first campaign was his last. His orders, relayed to him by a friendly Indian runner, were to move south. And after consulting a tree to ascertain from its lichen which way was south and taking no lip from subordinates who ventured to correct him, well, Colonel Macomb set out on a purposeful journey to rout the enemy and entangle his troops so far northwest in the forest primeval that they were eventually rescued by settlers moving inland. Anyway, Mrs. Merriweather gave a 30-minute description of Colonel Macomb's exploits. I discovered that if I bent my knees, I could tuck them underneath my costume and more or less sit. I sat down and I listened to Mrs. Merriweather's drone and the bass drums boom, and I was soon fast asleep. Oh well. They said later that Mrs. Merriweather was putting her all into the grand finale, and she crooned "pork" with the confidence born of pine trees and butter beans entering on cue. And well, she waited a few seconds and then called "pork," and when nothing materialized, she yelled "pork." Well, I must have heard her in my sleep, or the band playing Dixie woke me, but it was when Mrs. Merriweather triumphantly mounted the stage with the state flag I chose to make my entrance. Oops. Well, chose is incorrect. I thought I'd better catch up with the rest of them. They told me later that Judge Taylor went out behind the auditorium and stood there slapping his knee so hard Mrs. Taylor brought him a glass of water and one of his pills. So it was so funny. She was so late getting on stage. It totally like threw Mrs. Merriweather, and Judge Taylor was laughing so hard he had to excuse himself. Mrs. Merriweather seemed to have a hit. Everybody was cheering so, but she caught me backstage and she told me I had ruined her pageant. She made me feel awful, but when Jim came to fetch me, he was sympathetic. He said he couldn't see my costume much from where he was sitting. How he could tell I was feeling bad under my costume, I don't know. But he said I did all right. I just came in a little late, that was all. Jim was becoming almost as good as Atticus at making you feel right when things went wrong. Almost. Not even Jim could make me go through that crowd. And he consented to wait backstage with me until the audience left. So she was a little embarrassed. You want to take it off, Scout? He asked. Nah, I'll keep it on, I said. I could hide my mortification under it. Y'all want to ride home? Somebody asked. No, sir. No, thank you, I heard Jim say. It's just a little walk. Be careful of Hates, the voice said. Better still tell the Hates to be careful of Scout. There aren't many folks left now, Jim told me. Let's go. Well, we went through the auditorium to the hallway and then down the steps, and it was still black dark. And the remaining cars were parked on the other side of the building, and their headlights were a little help. If some of them were going in our direction, we could see better, said Jim. Here, Scout, let me hold on to your hook. So the ham hook, the very top. So he's trying to maneuver her by holding the top of her costume. You might lose your balance. I can see all right. Yeah, but you might lose your balance. I felt a slight pressure on my head, and I assumed that Jim had grabbed that end of the ham. You got me? Uh-huh. Well, we began crossing the black schoolyard, straining to see our feet. Jim, I said, I forgot my shoes. They're back behind the stage. Well, let's go get them. But as we turned around, the auditorium lights went off. You can get them tomorrow, he said. Oh, but tomorrow's Sunday, I protested as Jim turned me homeward. Well, you can get the janitor to let you in. Scout? Hmm, nothing. Well, Jim hadn't started like that in a long time. I wondered what he was thinking. He'd tell me when he wanted to, probably when we got home. Now I felt his fingers pressing the top of my costume. Too hard, it seemed. I shook my head. Jim, you don't have to. Hush a minute, Scout, he said, pinching me. We walked along silently. Minute's up, I said. What you thinking about? I turned to look at him, but his outline was barely visible. Thought I heard something, he said. Stop a minute. We stopped. You hear anything? He asked. No. We'd not gone 5 paces before he made me stop again. Jim, are you trying to scare me? You know I'm too quiet, he said, and I knew he wasn't joking. The night was still, and I could hear his breath coming easily beside me. Occasionally there was a sudden breeze that hit my bare legs, but that was all that remained of the promised windy night. This was the stillness before a thunderstorm. We listened. I heard an old dog just then, I said. It's not that, Jim was answered. I hear it when we're walking along, but when we stop, I don't hear it. Oh, you hear my costume rustling. Oh, it's just Halloween, gotcha. I said it more to convince myself than Jim, for sure enough, as we began walking, I heard what he was talking about. It was not my costume. It's just old Cecil, said Jim presently. He won't get us again. Let's don't let him think we're hurrying. We slowed to a crawl, and I asked Jim how Cecil could follow us in this dark. Looked to me like he'd bump into us from behind. Well, I can see you, Scout, Jim said. How? I can't see you. Well, your fat streaks are showing. Mrs. Crenshaw painted them with that shiny stuff so they'd show up under the footlights. I can see you pretty well, and I expect Cecil can see you well enough to keep his distance. I'd show that Cecil that we knew he was behind us, and we were ready for him. Cecil Jacobs is a big wet hen, I yelled stubbornly. I yelled suddenly, turning around. We stopped. There was no acknowledgement except hen bouncing off the distant schoolhouse wall. I'll get him, said Jim. Hey, 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 answered the schoolhouse wall. It was unlike Cecil to have held out for so long. Once he pulled a joke, he'd repeat it time and again. We should have been leapt at already. Jim signaled for me to stop again. He said softly, Scout, can you take that thing off? Well, I think so, but I ain't got anything on under it much. Well, I got your dress here. I can't get it on in the dark. Okay, he said, never mind. Jim, are you afraid? No, I think we're almost to the tree now, and a few yards from that we'll be at the road. We can see the street light then. Jim was talking in a unhurried, flat, toneless voice. I wondered how long he'd try to keep the Cecil myth going. You reckon we ought to sing, Jim? No. Be real quiet again, Scout. We had not increased our pace. Jim knew as well as I that it was difficult to walk fast without stubbing a toe, tripping on stones and other inconveniences, and I was barefoot. Maybe it was the wind rustling the trees, but there wasn't any wind, and there weren't any trees except the big oak. Our company shuffled and dragged his feet as if wearing heavy shoes. Whoever it was wore thick cotton pants, and what I thought were trees rustling was the soft swish of cotton on cotton with every step. I felt the sand go cold under my feet, and I knew we were near the big oak. And Jim pressed my head. We stopped and listened. Shufflefoot had not stopped with us this time. His trousers swished softly and steadily, and then they stopped. He was running towards us with no child steps. Run, Scout! Run! Run! Jim screamed. I took one giant step and I found myself reeling, my arms useless, and in the dark, I couldn't keep my balance. Jim! Jim! Help me, Jim! Something crushed the chicken wire around me. Metal ripped on metal, and I fell to the ground and I rolled as far as I could, floundering to escape my wire prison. From somewhere near came scuffling, kicking sounds, sounds of shoes and flesh escaping dirt and roots. Someone rolled against me, and I felt Jim. He was up like lightning and pulling me with him. But though my head and shoulders were free, I was so entangled we didn't get very far. When we were nearly to the road, I felt Jim's hand leave me, felt him jerk backwards to the ground, and there was more scuffling, and then there came a dull crunching sound, and Jim screamed. I ran in the direction of Jim's scream, and I sank into a flabby male stomach, and its owner went, ugh, and tried to catch my arms, but they were tightly pinioned. His stomach was soft, but his arms were like steel. He slowly squeezed the breath out of me. I couldn't move. And suddenly, he was jerked backwards and flung to the ground, almost carrying me with him. And I thought, Jim's up. Now, one's mind works very slowly at times. Stunned, I stood there dumbly. The scuffling noises were dying, and someone wheezed, and the night was still again. Still, but for a man breathing heavily. Heavily breathing and staggering. And I thought he went to the tree and he leaned against it, and he coughed violently, a sobbing, bone-shaken cough. Jim? There was no answer, but the man's heavy breathing. Jim? Jim didn't answer. The man began moving around as if searching for something, and I heard him groan and pull something heavy along the ground. It was slowly coming to me that there were now 4 people under the tree. Atticus? The man was walking heavily and unsteadily toward the road. I went to where I thought he'd been, and I felt frantically along the ground, reaching out with my toes, and presently I touched someone. Jim? My toes touched trousers, a belt buckle, buttons, and something I couldn't identify, a collar and a face. A prickly stubble on the face told me it wasn't Jim's, and I smelled stale whiskey. I made my way along what I thought was the direction of the road. I wasn't sure because I'd been turned around so many times. But I found it, and I looked down at the street light. A man was passing under it, and the man was walking with the staccato steps of someone carrying a load that was too heavy for him. He was going around the corner. He was carrying Jim, and Jim's arm was dangling crazily in front of him. By the time I reached the corner, the man was crossing our front yard. Light from our front door framed Atticus for an instant, and he ran down the steps, and together he and the man took Jim inside. And I was at the front door when they were going down the hall. Aunt Alexandra was running to meet me. Call Dr. Reynolds. Atticus's voice came sharply from Jim's room. Where's Scout? Here she is, Aunt Alexandra called, pulling me along with her to the telephone. She tugged at me anxiously. I'm all right, Auntie. I said, you better call. She pulled the receiver from the hook and said, Eula May, get Dr. Reynolds. Quick. Agnes, is your father home? Oh, God, where is he? Please tell him to come over here as soon as he comes in. Please. It's urgent. Well, there was no need for Aunt Alexandra to identify herself. People in Macomb, they knew each other's voices. Atticus came out of Jim's room, and the moment Aunt Alexandra broke the connection, Atticus took the receiver from her. He rattled the hook, and then he said, Eula May, get me the sheriff, please. Heck, Atticus Finch. Someone's been after my children. Jim's hurt. Between here and the schoolhouse. Well, I can't leave my boy. Well, run out there for me, please, and see if he's still around. Well, I doubt if you'll find him now, but I'd like to see him if you do. I gotta go now. Thanks, Heck. Atticus, is Jim dead? No, Scout. Look after her, sister, he called as he went down the hall. Now, Aunt Alexandra's fingers trembled as she unwound the crushed fabric and the wire around me. Are you all right, darling? She asked me over and over. She worked me free. It was a relief to be out. My arms were beginning to tingle, and they were red with small hexagonal marks. I rubbed them, and they felt better. Auntie, is Jim dead? No, no, darling. He's unconscious. We won't know how badly he's hurt until Dr. Reynolds gets here. Jean Louise, what happened? I don't know. She left it at that. She brought me something to put on, and had I thought about it then, I would never have let her forget it. In her distraction, Auntie brought me my overalls. Put these on, darling, she said, handing me the garments she most despised. She rushed back to Jim's room and then came to me in the hall, and she patted me vaguely, and then she went back to Jim's room. A car stopped in front of the house, and I knew Dr. Reynolds' step almost as well as I know my father's. He had brought Jim and me into the world, and he'd led us through every childhood disease known to man, including the time Jim fell out of the treehouse. He never lost our friendship. Dr. Reynolds said if we'd been boil prone, things would have been different, but we doubted it. Meaning boils, big boils you get on your skin. That grosses the doc out. He came in the door and said, "Good Lord." He walked around me and said, "Well, you're still standing," and changed his course. And he knew every room in that house. He also knew that if I was in bad shape, so was Jim. After 10 forevers, Dr. Reynolds returned. Is Jim dead? I asked. Far from it, he said, squatting down to me. He's got a bump on his head just like yours, and a broken arm. Scout, look that way. No, don't turn your head. Roll your eyes. Now look over yonder. He's got a bad break, and as far as I can tell now, it's at the elbow, like somebody tried to wring his arm off. Now, look at me. So, guys, his arm isn't just broke here. It's not. It has been jammed. It is bending the wrong way. So it is not just here, but is trying to wring it off. It's flapping back this way. Not a good look for anybody. Okay. Okay. All right. Now, then he's not dead? No. Dr. Reynolds got to his feet. We can't do much tonight, he said. Well, except to try and make him as comfortable as we can. We'll have to x-ray his arm. It looks like he'll be wearing his arm way out here. Out by his side for a while. Don't worry, though. He'll be as good as new. Boys his age bounce. While he was talking, Dr. Reynolds had been looking keenly at me, lightly fingering the bump that was coming on my forehead. You don't feel broke anywhere, do you? Dr. Reynolds' small joke made me smile. Then you don't think he's dead, then? He put on his hat. No, I may be wrong, of course, but I think he's very alive. He shows all the symptoms of it. Go have a look at him, and when I come back, we'll get together and decide. Dr. Reynolds' step was young and brisk. Mr. Heck Tate's was not. His heavy boots punished the porch, and he opened the door awkwardly, but he said the same things Dr. Reynolds said when he came in. You all right, Scout? He added. Yes, sir. I'm gonna go in and see Jim. Atticus and them's in there. I'll go with you, said Mr. Tate. Aunt Alexandra had shaded Jim's reading lamp with a towel, and his room was dim. Jim was lying on his back, and there was an ugly mark along one side of his face, and his left arm lay out from his body. His elbow was bent slightly, but in the wrong direction. Jim was frowning. Jim? Atticus spoke. He can't hear you, Scout. He's out like a light. He's coming around, but Dr. Reynolds put him out again. Yes, sir. I retreated. Jim's room was large and square, and Aunt Alexandra was sitting in a rocking chair by the fireplace. The man who brought Jim was standing in the corner, leaning against the wall. He was some countryman. I didn't know. He'd probably been at the pageant, was in the vicinity when it happened. He must have heard our screams and come running. Atticus was standing by Jim's bed. Mr. Heck Tate stood in the doorway. His hat was in his hand, and a flashlight bulged from his pants pocket. He was in his working clothes. Come on in, Heck, said Atticus. Did you find anything? I can't conceive of anybody low down enough to do a thing like this, but I hope you found him. Mr. Tate sniffed, and he glanced sharply at the man in the corner and nodded to him. And then he looked around the room at Jim and Aunt Alexandra and then Atticus. Sit down, Mr. Finch, he said pleasantly. Atticus said, let's all sit down. Let's all sit down. Have that chair, Heck, and I'll get another one from the living room. Well, Mr. Tate sat in Jim's desk chair, and he waited until Atticus returned and settled himself. And I wondered why Atticus had not brought a chair for the man in the corner, but Atticus knew the ways of country people far better than I. Some of his rural clients would park their long-eared steeds under the chinaberry trees in the backyard, and Atticus would often keep appointments on the back steps. This one was probably more comfortable where he was. Mr. Finch, said Mr. Tate, I'll tell you what I found. I found a little girl's dress. It's out there in my car. That your dress, Scout? Yes, sir. If it's a pink one with smocking, I said. Mr. Tate was behaving as if he were on a witness stand. He liked to tell things his own way, untrammeled by state or defense. Sometimes it took him a while. Well, I found some funny-looking pieces of muddy-colored cloth. That's my costume, Mr. Tate. Well, Mr. Tate ran his hands down his thighs, and he rubbed his left arm, and he investigated Jim's mantelpiece, and then he seemed to be interested in the fireplace. His fingers sought his long nose. What is it, Heck? Said Atticus. Mr. Tate found his neck and rubbed it. Bob Ewell's lying on the ground under that tree down yonder, with a kitchen knife stuck up under his ribs. He's dead, Mr. Finch. So the plot thickens. The plot thickens. So we've seen Aunt Alexandra definitely have a change of her colors, so to speak, no pun intended. She's starting to see things a little bit more open-mindedly, having had that incident. And she had a weird spidey sense feeling that something weird was going to happen earlier. Sure enough, but she didn't know. I mean, she didn't know how to pinpoint it, obviously. And they've been attacked. And Jim's arm, as far as we know, at least broken, hanging the wrong way. And if you remember at the very, very beginning of the book, if you look at chapter 1, go ahead, look at it. Look at it. What do those first lines of chapter 1 say, guys? When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. So she's telling that story from that first moment all the way here to this incident. But we don't stop to think about it. Harper Lee gives us a hook about Jem and being the older brother. And yeah, he had his, scraped knees and whatever, and broke his arm. First sentence out of the track, out of the starting gate. And now we know how that arm was broken. It was wrenched. We don't know who Well, we do know how we know that Bob Ewell was going to kill him. That was how he was going to get back at Atticus. He was going to kill Jem and Scout. He started after Judge Taylor, got scared away, because he's a weenie. He then tried to harass Helen. Bob Ewell's his kind are like mosquitoes. They always hover around you and they're just an annoyance. And you try to bypass it. There comes a point when you can't. And you know my motto: choices, consequences. For every choice, positive or negative, that you make, there is a consequence, positive or negative. And sometimes we learn things the hard way, even though we're told. And sometimes we learn them the easy way because we remember what we were told. But the choices we make help dictate who we are as adults. It's called our schema, schema. And our schema are those experiences from the time we're born that help us make judgments, appropriate judgments, things we like, we don't like, foods we like and we don't like. People that you shouldn't, unfortunately, should or shouldn't hang out with, who are a good influence or a poor influence. So Harper Lee is using the kids to tell the tale because we all have experiences from the time we're little. You can stop right now and think of things that stick out in your mind from when you were little, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to now. Things that you remember either with grief or maybe anger or complete excitement and happiness. It's nothing new, guys. It's nothing new. But it's using those experiences for the greater good. Using to have an open mind and an open heart with people. It's very easy to be negative. It's an easy thing to get into, and especially as a teenager when you're kind of bleh, and hormonal and pubescent, blah, 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 blah. But you got to be the bigger person. And it is not always easy. You've got to be the mockingbird. Remember what I said, we all have the blue jay moments, all of us. You're lying if you say you don't. And you're lying if you're saying you're a complete mockingbird all the time. You have to strive for that. You have to catch yourself in those moments and go, this is not right. And someday, maybe even right now, you're role models for people. People look to you, siblings, friends, family. Yeah, it's a hard time. And you know what? I'm really kind of glad we have this coronavirus. Something good does come out of it. It makes us stop and not take things for granted. 2, it makes us, no matter what our home life is, good, bad, or ugly, it makes us stop and think. 3, when you are experiencing, we're starting to have some of those experiences. That's so weird because I said in our lifetimes, we've not experienced those things like the Great Depression. We're starting to see some of those things pop now. And I'm glad we're reading the story while this is going on. It's kind of eerie. It's kind of funky. Okay. All right. So now what you're going to do, 26, 27, 28, they're all on one sourcing page. Okay. We want to shoot. Don't procrastinate. And remember, there's 3 chapters, but you can get on and you can read with me in chunks. And then if you need to go back after this, you can go back and listen to chunks. Okay. I'll send out an email and let everybody know. And tomorrow on Tuesday, I will put the last 3 chapters, and I'm on ball. I'm just telling you. Okay. I love you. You're my peeps. Please, please make good choices. Be safe. You've heard that. You've heard it all ad nauseum. Just do it. Okay. Love, love and hugs. And I will talk to you tomorrow. We'll finish up the book. Love you, and I will see you.